Hi, everyone. Welcome back from our break. We're going to have our second presenter give us her presentation now. So Larissa recently earned an MS in Natural Resources at the University of Arizona, where she studied habitat use and streamflow requirements of desert fishes. Prior to completing her master's and becoming a Canal Sea Grant Fellow in the Restoration Center, Larissa worked on fisheries management issues throughout the Rocky Mountains, holding positions with the National Park Service in Yellowstone, Trout Unlimited in Montana, Idaho Fish and Game, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Salt Lake City, Utah. Thank you very much, Larissa, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Christine, and thank you all for being here. I see so many people from the office, so I really appreciate it. And I wanted to start off by saying I will talk a lot about my research today, but my main goal is to kind of give you an overview of the desert and what's going on in the desert, to inform everyone that there is water in the desert, there are fish in the desert, and there's some really exciting work that I think is going on there, and also to talk about, we're Canals Fellows, so we're really thinking about the intersection of science and policy. So to really talk about some of the policy implications of this work and how policy is really guiding what we can do with all of this information that we're producing. So I think that's some of the most exciting aspects of this work. And I want to start by acknowledging my co-authors on this work. So Zach Nemec was another graduate student in the lab while I was there, and we worked together on these projects a lot. And then my advisor, Scott Bonar, of the Arizona USGS Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. So we also had a lot of collaborators and funders. So the majority of our funding and collaboration was with the US Fish and Wildlife Service. But of course, we also worked with USGS. We were accessing a lot of Forest Service land and working with the Forest Service. And then Arizona Game and Fish Department also provided a lot of support. And of course, the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. So with all that context in mind, I like to start with a picture of my field technicians because they help make a lot of this work happen, and it just shows another aspect of the desert, right? So we've got, look at this stream flow, there's water. Everyone's always surprised that it's so green. So this is the picture that I want to paint for you of this desert, of this really diverse landscape. And here's another picture. This is one of my study sites, and this is the Verde River. So this is one of the study sites that helps represent kind of what we've got going on in the desert and at these locations. So you can see this dry desert shrubland. We've got mountains in the distance. You can tell it's, well, maybe you can't tell, but it's a little higher elevation, some cooler temperatures up there. And then we've got houses in the distance and homes right kind of on the bank. So that represents some of those issues that we see. So there's potential for erosion, and there's also groundwater extraction from some of that development along the stream. And in terms of the climate of the desert, I like to characterize it as this land of extremes. So we have extreme heat, and then sometimes there's extreme drought. Thank you. And then we have monsoon seasons. So then there's extreme rain events. And this is reflected in our stream flow as well. So a lot of our native species have adapted to this type of climate and this type of environment, and even that stream flow. And then geographically, where we're talking about, all of this research was in this kind of transition zone. So in Arizona, we have the Colorado Plateau. So it's this high elevation area. And then we have this transition zone that's called the Mogollon Rim, and that's where much of my research took place. So we have this really unique environment because you're transitioning from this high elevation area down to that basin and range desert. So that's kind of what you think of like in Tucson, where I was living with those saguaro cactuses and really, really dry habitat. So it's kind of this in-between transition zone. So that provides a really unique habitat for fish. So who are these fish we're talking about? These were some of the native species that we were working with in my study sites. So here we have longfin dace, speckled dace, round-tailed chub, desert sucker, Sonora sucker, spiked dace, and loach minnow. And two of these species, spiked dace and loach minnow, are listed as endangered. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about management of these streams and of these systems. Unfortunately, we also have a lot of non-native species. So as we all know, non-native species in the US are a big contributor to declines of native species. So through predation, competition, even hybridization, these species can cause a real problem for some of our native species. And so some of those species were introduced. There are even fish species that we're angling for. So those are smallmouth bass, yellow bullhead, rainbow trout, green sunfish, Brielle crayfish, common carp, and red shiner. And so that kind of leads to my objective of the first chapter of my master's thesis, which was to develop these habitat suitability criteria for non-native species in 4 Arizona streams. And so I focused on non-native species, and as I mentioned, this was part of a larger project, and my colleague Zach focused on native species, but we really did this work together. So it's just really to give us an understanding of what habitat are these species using. So what is habitat suitability criteria? So really we're just defining ranges of habitat for a specific species and trying to understand if they're using this habitat preferentially in terms of what's available in a certain stream. So it can also be used to model suitable habitat at various flows. So especially in Arizona, where water is scarce and there are changing stream flows, we really want to know what kind of habitat do we have available to these different species at these various flows. So that's when we can develop models in programs like PHAB-SIM or River 2D. So they are able to use models to simulate what a stream would look like at various flows. So this is an example of that. So this was done after some work that my lab had done in Cherry Creek, Arizona. So also this is taking the work of previous habitat suitability criteria that was developed for Cherry Creek and putting it into this simulation. So I'll kind of walk through this because here we have on top we have speckled dace, and on the bottom we have green sunfish. And so you can see the habitat that is provided for each of these species. In blue, we have green sunfish habitat, and in red, we have speckled dace habitat. And then you see this bar in the middle, and so that's our discharge. So this is the habitat available at 100 CFS, or 100 cubic feet per second. And then as I click through, we'll see the discharge decrease, and you'll see how habitat changes as discharge decreases. So we already saw a big reduction in speckled dace habitat in that side channel, and it continues to change as we see a reduction in flow. And so this can be used in a lot of different ways, but especially for allocating flows in different streams. So in this stream, it's more of a natural system, but it's important to understand also for more of our managed systems that do have dams. And this can also be used in restoration. So habitat suitability criteria, I'll talk a little bit more about those metrics, but we're looking at depths and velocities and various habitat variables, I guess, that we can plan for and really design for in restoration. So that was of Cherry Creek, which was not one of my study sites, but these were the 4 streams that I focused on. So in the middle, we have the Verde River, and then moving further east, we have Tonto Creek, Eagle Creek, and the Blue River. And then you can see lots of dots throughout those streams. And as you know, this is the entire state of Arizona, so this is a pretty big area to cover. And each of those points represents an access point, so a place where we were able to get our crews in and access the stream. And then at each of those access points, we placed approximately 30 to 60 electrofishing grids. And I'm realizing too, especially I remember in one of Sam's talks, someone said, what is electrofishing? So for some of you people who are less familiar with streams and freshwater systems, I'll talk a little bit about that. Electrofishing is a technique where we go out and we apply electrical current to the water in a small contained area. And this allows us to temporarily stun the fish, and then it's easier to capture them. So they live, it's non-lethal. Yep, so sometimes there are mortalities. But it's a way for us to capture fish more easily. And so we used a special kind of electrofishing that's called a pre-positioned aerial electrofishing device. So that's what I say when I mean we placed all these grids. So you can kind of see here in the stream, I drew a little picture to help you highlight, but that's what our electrofishing grid looked like. So it's these two hollow metal rods, and they're attached by an extension cord to an onshore generator. And you might think, wow, that's such a disturbance to the system. You know, wouldn't fish move away? But we use this technique in conjunction with an 11-minute wait time to reduce kind of this fright bias. So the fright bias would be pushing fish out of their natural habitat. And so we did this because you can see it's a really small scale. We want to know on a micro habitat level what kind of substrates. You can see all of these habitat metrics I'm talking about. What are the substrates that these fish are using, the depth, the velocity in these areas, overhead cover, and temperature. So those were the habitat variables we measured. And you can see Sierra here. This is our stream flow. She's measuring stream flow, and we could also use that to measure depth. And then we have Sarah taking down fish species, total length, and of course our location in that GPS tablet. And then I won't get too deep into the data analysis, but in case anyone's interested, in order to develop the criteria, we initially reported the central 50% range that a species was using. So we did this for each species in each stream. And we performed a one-sided chi-square analysis to understand if they were preferentially selecting this habitat in terms of what was available in the system. Then, since I did this across 4 streams, we tried to develop, we did develop generalized criteria. So looking across our streams where we had enough species throughout them all. And then we tested transferability of that generalized criteria to our specific streams, because we really want to understand, okay, we might have information on this in the Verde River, but does that apply to our other streams in Arizona? And can we use this information in different locations? And then we developed logistic regression models to understand how different habitat variables were influencing the presence or absence of these species in each site. So for the results, I kind of will give you a general overview. I developed habitat suitability criteria for 7 different species, since I was focusing on the non-native species for these 5 habitat variables that I mentioned. And then we also were able to develop generalized criteria for 3 of those species. And so to give you an example of kind of what kind of information we're providing, we have that range, we have that minimum and the maximum, and then we have whether it's level of significance there. So if they were indeed significantly selecting this range. And then as another example, here's kind of how we visually presented that information. You can see in those highlighted in yellow are those where species were indeed significantly selecting different habitat in terms of what was available. And here's just an example, but we can see that non-natives were selecting shallower habitat, or at least narrower ranges in terms of what was available. And then one that stands out is just that the carp were selecting for deeper habitat. And so we developed these, you can see on the x-axis, we have depth, and then all of our species on the y, and all of our streams on the other side of the y-axis. But we did this for each variable. And just some highlights of some of those results, because there's lots to go through. But on the top, we have our Sonora sucker. So that's one of our native species. And we found that these species were selecting areas with higher velocities. So that might be what we'd expect if these species are adapted to some of those flood flow events and some of those, so those higher velocity events. As I mentioned, we have our carp. Those were selecting for deeper pools. And then we have rainbow trout, and rainbow trout are introduced in the system, so they're non-native, but as we would expect, they're selecting for these colder temperatures. And then we have our green sunfish, and they were also selecting for warmer temperatures, as were many of our non-native species, kind of besides the rainbow trout. So I kind of like to say, well, we discovered the fish need water, right? We know that they need water. And I kind of say that jokingly, but in Arizona, that's really important because we don't always have all of the information about what habitat these species are using. So I kind of joke that, yes, we show that fish need water, but this kind of leads into the policy implications of this work, or that helps us defend those water rights for these fish species. And I was really just looking at the in-stream habitat at this microhabitat scale. But when we're talking about stream flow, that kind of leads into the second chapter of my thesis, which I don't have a ton of time to get into, but I want to briefly mention. Because when we talk about stream flow in Arizona, I mentioned these monsoon events. This is a hydrograph at one of my study sites. So this is on the Verde River. And just so you get a sense of Arizona and what the stream flow is like, this is pretty typical of a lot of my study streams. So you can see this is in CFS, the discharge in cubic feet per second. And you can see we have those winter rain events, winter snowfall, and then we have higher flows during that time period and during that kind of spring runoff as we see this gradual decrease. And then you can see how low the flows get throughout July. So this is really significant. I just want to, if anything, take home that point that stream flow is so unique in the desert. And then in August and September and October, you see some of those extreme spikes. Those are those monsoonal events. So those are things that some of our native fish species have adapted to. That previous work shows that those flows can preferentially or kind of I guess, move non-native species out of the system, and they find it more difficult to return after an event like this than non-natives do, or than native species do, pardon me. And so I only had data from this 1 year, so I was looking at 2017, and this was all this work was done during base flow conditions, so we're really describing habitat that's available to these species at base flow conditions, but there's a lot of variation throughout the year and even throughout space. So since I couldn't do anything about the time component, I looked spatially. So I was trying to examine spatial differences in those flow ecology relationships. So I was able to use some of these applications from USGS that help us make estimates about these flood flows in different locations. And we saw a positive correlation between the presence of our native species Sonora sucker and these estimated flood flows. So where there were areas with higher estimated flood flows, we saw more Sonora sucker species. So that's just really interesting to think about. And then I talked about those management and policy implications. So there's a lot of development going on in the Verde Valley, so one of my study sites, and that affects that groundwater extraction. And so we're really seeing more and more people move into this high desert area. And then, of course, there's Phoenix, which is the largest city in Arizona. And I found the 5th largest city in the US, which is wild to me. And so a lot of that water comes from the Verde River and the Salt River. And so both the Verde, one of my study streams, and the Tonto Creek, those both flow into the Salt. And so we're talking about a lot of water going to Phoenix, which is a growing city. So just that there's high demand for this water, and we really need to understand the habitat that our fish species are using to be able to protect water for them. There's also mining is a really big industry in Arizona. And so different companies have wanted to extract surface water from the stream. Some even use the flood flows, saying they're destructive flows, and requesting to take water just off the top just during these periods. So it's really important for us to continue to understand some of those flow ecology relationships. And then agricultural use is a really big user of some of this water. And so then I point out the scientists, because the onus is really on us, on the scientists to defend in-stream flow rates for these species. Luckily, there are some tools for us to be able to do that. So specifically on the Verde River, 40 miles of this river is designated as wild and scenic. So that's really exciting because it was designated with these wildlife and fisheries values and recreational values. So whether that's boating or fishing for native or non-native species or birding, there are other research groups in association with the Forest Service kind of looking into some of those values. But this allows us to defend water in the streams to protect these values that we've identified that make this river wild and scenic. I think that's kind of exciting. And then there are state water rights. So these can get complicated, as maybe some of you already know, but Arizona is a state of prior appropriation. So really the first in time is the first in right. Whoever's first to have that water right, it's also a use it or lose it state. So you have to be using that water. And so this is really for human use, for human consumption. But then in 1990, the Arizona Department of Water Resources issued its first in-stream flow permit. And so that's really exciting because that's a flow permit on behalf of fish and wildlife to keep water in the stream. And people have fought this, right? So that's not necessarily a popular idea to keep water in the stream for fish and wildlife. But because of that work on Cherry Creek, because of these habitat suitability criteria, my previous members of my lab and my advisor have been called to court. And this was held up in the Arizona Supreme Court with support from some of these habitat suitability criteria. So saying, you know, well, we know that fish need this amount of water for this amount of habitat to exist in these streams. So just a really important policy application, I think, for the future. And just to close out and bring it all back to Arizona and the lab, I'm going to end with some pretty pictures. But you can see kind of how dry this landscape is and how scarce water is. You know, it's that prize when you find a watering hole like this. But just to show that these issues will continue to exist. Water will continue to be scarce in the desert, and even this basic understanding of what our fish are using and needing for habitat is really important there. So I hope I gave you a little snapshot of the desert and that you're excited about some of the fish that live there. I want to acknowledge all of the many people who helped me, from my advisor to my committee, to the co-op unit and field technicians, and just many supporters from all of these agencies and groups. So thanks.
Okay, questions for Larissa?
Hi, great job. That was awesome to learn about the desert and desert environments. I did have one question regarding the non-native species. I'm assuming with the non-natives, they're stocking these species. So would you say that some of this, have you seen sort of any implications with your research in support of stocking or anything, or sort of affecting that?
So in a lot of the places where I was working, they actually were no longer stocking these non-native species. So for instance, I guess like bass species, that's a huge, bass fishing is a huge industry. These were placed historically, and then I think it's one of those things where we kind of realized that it may have been at the detriment of, or to the detriment of our native species. So those are, for the most, those are no longer being stocked in the area. Like a lot of them, like red shiner, aren't even species that we're interested in fishing. Rainbow trout are a little bit different in the desert. So there are places where they are being introduced, and they are managing for those species, but not in any of my study systems actually. So maybe like closer to Lee's Ferry in the Grand Canyon, that area. But yeah, I think there's definitely been a push towards native species management, and in some of these systems, they've actually been stocking some of the native species. I hope that helps.
Other questions?
Well, I remember the graphic. It was a hydrographic of the annual inputs of water, and I was just curious. Obviously, there's tolerances for a variety of reasons, whether it's DO or temp or whatever. But I remember a study that Maryland did like 20 years ago or something, where they looked at pulses from unusual rainfall events that were during the hottest periods of the summer, and the influence that had on stream temperature in general, and the ability for some of the temperature sensitive species to adopt, you know, some sort of method to get away from that or survive that. And I'm thinking that some of these are cold water, or not necessarily cold water like trout, but the dace, the endangered ones, probably are temperature sensitive. And did you look at any of that type of impact or parameters with respect to those data sets?
So we didn't look at any of the timing of flood flow events like that and how that changes in temperature. So unfortunately, yeah, it was just a really short time period that we were able to sample. a lot of that is just like the dangers of being in those environments during a flash flood. But you're right, we also didn't go back afterwards to look at kind of how those, that would be really interesting to look into further, kind of how the temperatures after some of those flooding events affect the distributions of those different species, if I answer that correctly. So really our temperature ranges that we're giving are just during those base flows of what's being selected. That's really, and it's during those hot summer months before monsoons.
Hey, can you expand a little bit on what kind of protections are associated with the designation of a wild and scenic river?
Definitely. So that's a really good question, and I don't know that I'll do the answer justice. But the wild and scenic rivers are designated like with these values that they're associated with it. And so I guess I'm not sure where the limits fall, but we're allowed to protect for those values. And so that's where I mentioned those recreational and wildlife values. So they're kind of designated for that reason. So it's up to really the management agency, and in this case, it's the Forest Service managing that area to determine how to protect those values. So I guess that didn't really provide tons of extra information, but yeah, I'll have to look into kind of how it actually. I don't know how it would actually like hold up in like a court situation or anything like that. But I think with the Forest Service, they're really interested in, and there are other labs doing other research I mentioned on like the birds or on hydrology to just understand what's needed to keep those values where at least where we are right now. Yeah. Okay.
Is this for the webinar?
Yes.
No, okay. Speaker. Anyways, I wanted to ask about like technology and advancement in data analysis or modeling. Have you seen over the last few years? Because it seems like a lot of the policy making around this has been done in the past, but there's a lot of new technology, or at least new ways of analyzing data, probably new ways of modeling habitat that are pretty current. So I'm wondering if any recent advances are maybe helping the policy side of things, and maybe not this specifically, but maybe in general in the Desert Southwest.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, kind of the link between these advances and how we model and understand the desert habitat and the policies in place to protect it. I think one example that I can think of is USGS in Arizona is doing a lot of research on the link between groundwater and surface water. So especially in the Verde River, it's a really unique system where there are areas where it's a gaining stream. So it's like gaining float water from the groundwater to the surface water, and then where it's losing water to the groundwater, and that's kind of more common as you move downstream, that you have like this losing stream, but the Verde has these weird areas where it's gaining. So a better understanding of that groundwater and surface water connection is one area where I think there's potential for further policies. I know there used to not be many limitations to groundwater extraction, and now the state does regulate that a little bit more. So that's one example that I can think of, but there are probably also a lot more, especially on habitat modeling.
Hey, great job. I have two unrelated questions. The first is whether you had any interaction with landowners while you were sampling or resistance from other water users. And the second question was about what fish species you're holding in your closing slide.
Oh, yeah. So the first question was interaction with landowners. So one of the days I remember being out in the field and we hear a lot of like movement, and there was a lot just loud noises, and there was someone like ranging in their cattle. So we got to meet this awesome woman with her cowgirl hat on horseback, kind of wrangling in some of her cattle. But most of the interactions were really pleasant in the experiences that we had. We also were able to access some areas via private land, and usually that was where there was already a relationship established between the Forest Service and the landowner. So our interactions were pretty positive. We did have some cases where people were hesitant about endangered species status. So I think people were concerned about any kind of action that they might have to take based on what we found, if we found a species that that was protected near their property. So there's definitely some resistance there. And then your second question, oh, it was just that photo at the end. That's me with a Sonora sucker species. So that same species there. Yeah, that's a good closing question.
Okay, so thank you so much, Larissa. I guess we're gonna wrap it up for today. And for anyone who has online questions, we will be putting you in touch with the presenters afterwards. So thank you so much, everyone.